A black woman boards a plane, takes her assigned seat in first class, and within minutes, a flight attendant tells her, "You don't belong here." But what happens next? Is it just another case of quiet humiliation in the sky? Or does this woman have a truth that will shake the very people trying to displace her? Why does a junior flight attendant freeze when she sees who the woman really is? What secret does the airline's executive team scramble to cover up until one powerful message grounds the crew entirely? And how does a single act of calm resistance turn into a global call for justice? This isn't just a story about a seat. It's about who we allow to sit at the table and what happens when someone refuses to be moved. Her name is Dr. Nadira Ellis. And for the next 12 minutes, you're about to witness the moment she redefined what it means to belong. If this kind of story speaks to your soul, hit that like, share, and subscribe right now. Because you're not just watching a story, you're stepping into it. Let's begin. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind where the terminal buzzed but didn't shout. Families clustered near charging stations. Business travelers hunched over tablets. Flight 718 to Seattle had just opened boarding at Gate C31 in Newark Liberty International Airport. Dr. Nadira Ellis stood a few feet back from the line, suitcase upright by her side, navy coat folded neatly over one arm. She didn't check her phone. She didn't scroll. She simply waited. There was a quiet elegance about her. Her curls were pulled into a low, clean bun, her blazer sharp, her expression soft but unreadable. If anyone had noticed her, they might have thought she was a diplomat, or maybe a professor, but no one did. Boarding began. Group 1 was called. Nadira stepped forward, lifting her carry-on with practiced ease. The gate agent, a young woman in a red vest, barely looked up as she scanned Nadira's pass. The scanner beeped, then beeped again. The agent frowned slightly and tapped her screen. Nadira offered a calm smile. "Is there a problem?" "No, just a system hiccup," the agent replied, her tone distracted. "Go ahead." Nadira nodded and proceeded down the jet bridge. She exhaled only once she was out of sight. Something about the pause at the scanner it felt familiar. She didn't dwell on it. Not yet. The inside of the aircraft was cool and bright. Cabin crew smiled automatically, moving with the rhythm of pre-departure routines. Nadira found her seat 1A, first class, window. She paused, double-checked the overhead bin, and was about to stow her luggage when she heard a voice. "Excuse me, miss, first class is ahead." Nadira turned. The voice came from a woman with a silver badge clipped to her Navy uniform, hair in a sleek ponytail, makeup flawless, her smile tight. "I know," Nadira said, calmly holding up her boarding pass. "Seat 1A." The woman's eyes flicked to the ticket, then back to Nadira. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Nadira replied, her voice low but steady. "Would you like to scan it?" The flight attendant didn't take the pass. She folded her arms. "We've had passengers try to sneak up here before. You wouldn't believe what people attempt these days." Nadira blinked slowly. "I'm not attempting anything. This is my seat." The moment hung there, not loud, but heavy. A man in one seat looked up from his phone. A woman 2 rows back adjusted her sunglasses and turned slightly toward them. The attendant still hadn't moved. "I'll just verify with the manifest," she said finally, stepping toward the galley without another glance. Nadira remained standing in the aisle, still holding her carry-on, still holding her composure. Inside, something flickered. Not rage, not shock, just a familiar ache, an old one. The ache of being questioned where others were welcomed. The ache of having to prove your place before being allowed to take it. She inhaled through her nose, slow and practiced, and she waited. A younger flight attendant approached a moment later. Nervous, uncertain. She looked at Nadira, then at the seat. Hi, I'm Rachel. I think there's just a quick check happening. If you'd like, I can take your bag. Nadira looked at her. Her tone was different, less performative, less defensive, more human. No, thank you. I'll wait until it's clear. Rachel nodded awkwardly and stepped back. The first-class cabin had grown quieter. The usual shuffle of bags, magazines, sips of sparkling water had stilled. Nadira could feel it. Eyes that didn't want to be seen watching her. Judgment simmering just under polite expressions. She had seen it in courtrooms. She had seen it in fundraisers, boardrooms, gala halls, parent-teacher meetings. And now, here, again. It never screamed. It insinuated. The lead flight attendant returned. Her name tag read Sloan. She was holding a tablet. It's not showing you on the first-class manifest, she said simply. Nadira tilted her head. Slightly. Would you like me to show you my email confirmation? Sloan didn't answer. Instead, she turned to Rachel. Page the gate agent. We'll need a manual recheck. Nadira stepped aside, not out of obedience, out of dignity. She placed her bag gently near her feet, folded her hands, and stood. She didn't speak again, didn't raise her voice, didn't ask why, because she already knew the why. The cabin watched as if unsure whether this was part of normal pre-flight procedure or something else. No one spoke to her. No one offered her their seat while she stood. No one said, "That's not right." But everyone felt it. The silence was louder than outrage. Nadira's thoughts drifted not away from the moment, but deeper into it. A younger version of herself would have said something. Maybe snapped. Maybe walked off the plane. Maybe cried. But she wasn't younger anymore. She knew the cost of speaking too soon. She had learned the power of waiting. She reached into her coat pocket, lifted her phone. One contact, one line. A voice on the other end didn't even say hello. It's starting, Nadira said softly. Red line protocol. 11 minutes. She hung up. The cabin, still unaware of what those 11 minutes would mean, shifted in their seats. A storm had started, not the kind with thunder or rain, the kind that started with assumption, the kind that ended with accountability. And Nadira Ellis, still standing near seat 1A, was no longer just a passenger. She was the test the crew didn't know they were about to take. The gate agent entered the cabin 5 minutes later, clipboard in hand, smile stiff and overly apologetic. She looked about 25, a bit too fresh-faced to handle the kind of tension that now lingered in the front of the plane, like humidity. She approached Sloan with a lowered voice, but the first-class cabin could still hear fragments of their conversation. She says, "Seat 1A. The system shows it. I confirmed it twice." Sloan frowned and didn't look at Nadira. "We'll try again. Sometimes it clears late." The agent blinked. "But she's valid." Sloan's tone sharpened. "I said we'll check again." Nadira didn't move. She didn't step in or interrupt. She had learned, long ago, the cost of defending what already belonged to her. Each defense chipped away at the dignity she worked so hard to protect. She remained by the galley, hands folded gently, gaze steady. Rachel hovered by the jump seat, watching both women, her fingers gripping the tablet tighter than necessary. A man in 1C lowered his phone, glancing from the screen to Nadira, then back again. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He simply assessed her the way people do when they're trying to make sense of a disruption. A woman in tude leaned toward her husband. She probably booked economy and tried to sneak up. She whispered, "I've heard of that," he replied, shaking his head. "Some people." The words trailed off but hung heavy. Nadira heard them. She didn't flinch, but inside, her breath hitched. Not in fear, not even in anger, just that familiar ache again, the ache of being reduced without being known. She looked down at her shoes, polished, steady, one foot slightly in front of the other, the stance of someone who's used to waiting longer than others for the same doors to open. Sloane returned to her post, standing between Nadira and the aisle. "I've asked management to reconfirm your status," she said, voice cool and clipped. "Until then, we're not authorized to seat you in 1A. "You're not authorized to seat me," Nadira replied gently. "In the seat I already paid for." Sloane didn't answer the question. She adjusted her blazer and turned to face the cabin. "We appreciate everyone's patience. We're handling a minor seating issue." The cabin buzzed with polite discomfort. That was the thing about first class. Everyone liked calm, order, whispered apologies. No one liked friction, especially not the kind that forced them to examine themselves. Rachel stepped forward. "Ma'am," she said to Nadira, voice soft, eyes unsure. "Would you like to wait in the front galley while we clear it up?" Nadira glanced behind her at the empty seat, then back to Rachel. "I'll stand." Rachel hesitated, then gave a small nod and stepped back. Behind them, a voice rose older, female, tinged with a kind of privilege that comes from decades of never being questioned. Why is this still an issue? It was the woman in 1B, blonde hair in a bun, white blouse buttoned to the collar, pearl earrings catching the light. "She doesn't belong in that seat," the woman said plainly. "Let someone else take it." No one corrected her. Rachel looked down. Sloane didn't even blink. Nadira slowly turned to face the woman, her expression unreadable. "I belong where my name is written," she said softly. The woman scoffed. These days everyone thinks they deserve everything. A few heads turned. Most didn't. Nadira didn't respond, not because she lacked words, but because she had learned which moments deserved silence. She glanced to her left. The curtain between first class and coach remained open just slightly. Through it, she could see a mother rocking a crying toddler. A college student trying to fit their oversized backpack into an overhead bin. A man with a straw hat and weathered face flipping through a travel magazine. And yet, up here, in this narrow, privileged space, the air had thickened into something sharp. Not from turbulence, from belief. The belief that people like her couldn't just belong, that they had to explain, justify, earn their way in every time, even with proof in hand. Rachel glanced up again, catching Nadira's eyes. There was a flicker there, something between apology and admiration, but the younger woman said nothing. The gate agent reappeared, this time holding a small portable scanner. "I double-checked," she said. "Passenger Ellis is confirmed in 1A. There's no issue." Her voice was louder than before. Firmer. Sloane froze. Then, just for a second, her polished veneer cracked. She blinked slowly, then smiled without warmth. "Well, sometimes the system glitches," she muttered. She didn't look at Nadira. She didn't offer the seat. She just walked toward the galley. The gate agent stood awkwardly, unsure whether to leave or say something else. Nadira gave her a small nod. "Thank you," she said quietly. The agent smiled and disappeared down the jet bridge. Rachel stepped forward again, her hands trembling slightly. "Would you like help with your bag?" Nadira looked at her. Something in the girl's posture had changed. Not guilt, not yet, but awareness. Nadira lifted her carry-on without effort. "No, thank you." She placed it in the overhead bin. Still, she did not sit. Not yet, because she wasn't waiting for permission. She was waiting to see who would speak, who would stand, who would notice what had just happened. The man in 3A opened his laptop. The woman in 2C started filming discreetly with her phone. Rachel stepped back. Sloane was nowhere to be seen, and Nadira remained standing, because sometimes sitting down too soon was how the world forgot what had just occurred. The moments after the gate agent left were strange, not chaotic, not even loud, but heavy, like everyone in the cabin had collectively chosen to breathe just a little more quietly. Rachel stood off to the side, arms folded across her chest, gripping the tablet so tightly her knuckles turned pale. She kept her eyes on the screen, but her attention wasn't on the manifest anymore. It was on Nadira. Nadira hadn't spoken since the confirmation. She remained near her seat, standing, her briefcase tucked neatly beneath the seat, her hands relaxed, her presence still, not passive, but deliberate. She was no longer waiting for permission. She was waiting to see what the silence would do. Passengers began moving again, tentatively. A man in 2A reached for a magazine. The woman in 2C stopped recording, but she didn't put her phone away. She held it loosely in her lap, thumb near the record button, just in case. From the galley. Footsteps approached again. Sloane returned with a new prop, a clipboard in hand, expression fixed. She didn't make eye contact with Nadira. Instead, she turned to Rachel. "We're going to run one more verification," she said aloud, projecting just enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. Sometimes passengers are bumped up without the proper authorization. The sentence hung there, pointed. Rachel opened her mouth, then hesitated. She looked at Nadira briefly, then at Sloane. "But she's confirmed," Rachel said, almost too softly. Sloane didn't acknowledge her. She pivoted toward the aisle, clipboard now clutched in both hands. Behind her, a few passengers nodded subtly. The couple in 1D exchanged a glance. The man leaned toward his wife and whispered something about people gaming the system. Nadira heard it. She always did. Her jaw tightened. But she didn't flinch. She didn't move. She thought of her grandmother, who had sat at the back of a city bus in 1958 and had never spoken a word about it because no one ever asked. And here she was, 65 years later, still standing, still waiting, not for a seat, for decency. Rachel lingered near the curtain. Her eyes bounced between the tablet and Sloane's clipboard. She wanted to speak. That much was clear. But something stopped her. Fear, loyalty. Maybe both. She turned slightly toward Nadira. "I'm sorry about the delay," she offered again. Her voice cracked at the edge, fragile and unsteady. Nadira gave her a nod. Just one. Not of gratitude, but of recognition. "I see you trying, and trying matters." Behind them, the curtain between first class and coach closed with a soft click. The message was clear: keep the problem contained. A few rows back, a man in a tailored navy suit closed his laptop gently. His name was Terrence Miller. He was quiet, observant, a retired university professor, black, mid-60s. His eyes followed Sloane, then shifted to Nadira. He had seen this dynamic before, in schools, on panels, in conference rooms where he'd been introduced as one of the good ones, and now in the sky. Rachel moved toward the galley, glancing back once before disappearing behind the curtain. The cabin grew still again. Then Sloane picked up the intercom handset. She turned her back toward Nadira and spoke low, but not so low that people couldn't hear. Can someone from the gate reconfirm the upgrade on passenger Ellis in 1A? It's not appearing under priority status. There it was. Not a denial. Just enough suggestion to stir doubt. The whisper that becomes the story. Nadira closed her eyes briefly. She wasn't praying. She was remembering. The fundraiser last fall when she'd been asked to show her invitation twice. The legal summit when security mistook her for the catering staff. The board meeting where her presentation was introduced as a surprise. Considering the speaker, and now here, again, still. Her eyes opened slowly. She adjusted the strap of her blazer and squared her shoulders. Across the aisle, the woman in 1B Barbara. Nadira had learned from the overheard check-in, leaned slightly over her armrest. "Do you travel often?" she asked, smiling politely, but without warmth. Nadira turned to her, gaze even. "Often enough," she said. Barbara chuckled softly. "I see. Probably work for one of those nonprofits. Right. They give upgrade perks now, don't they?" The implication didn't need explaining. Nadira said nothing, not because she lacked the words, but because responding would give the comment more dignity than it deserved. Barbara adjusted her seatbelt and sipped from a crystal-clear glass of sparkling water. She was satisfied with herself. A few rows back. Terrence Miller's expression hardened. He didn't say a word, but something inside him shifted. He knew that tone. He had spent decades walking through it. He watched Nadira, still standing, still composed. She hadn't moved, and she hadn't crumbled. Sloane returned to the aisle, clipboard now shaking slightly in her grip. She was losing control of the story she had tried to write. Nadira hadn't yelled, hadn't made a scene, but the silence, the calm, it unsettled more than any raised voice could. And now, the passengers were no longer passive. They were watching, not scrolling, not pretending, watching. Rachel reemerged from the galley and hesitated before stepping forward. She looked at Nadira again. "Ma'am," she said gently, we're still checking the manifest, but I wanted to say." She stopped. The words caught in her throat. She looked at Sloane, then back at Nadira. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Nadira didn't smile, didn't say thank you. She gave her a look that said, "I see you, and you still have time to choose." Rachel swallowed hard and stepped back. The cabin held its breath. From 2C, the woman who had been recording earlier, Janine. Her boarding pass had red-angled her phone just slightly again. Her thumb hovered over record. She had stopped earlier, but now she resumed. She had a feeling this wasn't over. She looked at Nadira. No nods, no smiles, just understanding, silent agreement. This matters, and they were all witnesses now. Nadira adjusted the strap of her bag and took a small step back, not because she was yielding, but because sometimes stepping back was the best way to be seen clearly. She stood a few feet from her seat in the narrow galley space, her hands loosely folded in front of her. Her expression was calm, but something behind her eyes had changed. She wasn't waiting for a seat anymore. She was waiting for the truth to reveal itself. Across the cabin. Rachel lingered near the jump seat, eyes flickering toward Nadira with increasing frequency. Her fingers tapped against the tablet in a rhythm that betrayed her nerves. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then finally whispered to herself, "Do something." But she didn't move. She looked toward the front where Sloane had disappeared behind the galley curtain again. Only the edge of her shadow was visible. She was on the phone, probably with operations or the gate crew. Rachel couldn't hear what she was saying, but the body language said enough: rigid shoulders, tight jaw, the kind of posture someone wore when trying to control a narrative they no longer owned. Meanwhile, the passengers were no longer pretending not to look. They watched Nadira, not with pity, not yet with admiration, but with that peculiar brand of attention people give when they realize something bigger than themselves is happening, and they're not sure if they're witnesses or bystanders. Barbara Whitman crossed her arms and stared out the window, lips pressed tight. Her fingers tapped against the armrest rhythmically, as if trying to drown out the echo of her own earlier comment. She had underestimated the woman now standing just steps away. It wasn't just about whether Nadira belonged in seat 1A. It was about why she, Barbara, had assumed she didn't. Nadira's gaze swept the cabin once, slow and measured, not accusing, not defensive, just aware. She saw the discomfort in 1C, the downcast glance in 2O, the phone angled discreetly in 2C. She saw Terrence Miller in 3A watching quietly, his expression unreadable but intentional. And she saw Rachel, struggling between silence and action. Her breath was steady, but inside her chest there was motion, a rolling wave of thoughts, memories, disappointments. Not again. Not here. She wasn't tired because she was standing. She was tired because she had stood too many times before. She remembered an elevator ride in DB where a stranger had asked if she was in the right building, a board meeting where the chair had referred to her as Miss Ellis, even after the fourth mention of Doctor. She had spent years building a reputation that preceded her except in rooms where her skin spoke louder than her resume. She inhaled again, this time slower. She wasn't angry. She was anchoring. Rachel finally stepped forward, her voice hesitant but audible. "Ma'am, your name is on the manifest. We confirmed it. There's nothing wrong." Nadira looked at her, meeting her eyes directly. "Then why am I still standing?" she asked, not unkindly. Rachel's mouth parted, but no answer came. She turned slightly toward the galley. I'll go talk to her again." She disappeared behind the curtain. Barbara shifted in her seat and looked briefly toward Nadira. This time, she didn't speak. Her posture had stiffened, and her eyes no longer carried smug certainty. There was something quieter now. Reflection, maybe even regret. Terrence Miller closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and sat forward. He wanted to say something, but he wasn't sure if this was the moment. Sometimes silence was respectful, other times it was cowardice wrapped in courtesy. He exhaled. Rachel returned, but she wasn't alone. Sloane followed, clipboard clutched to her chest, face pale. "We're still clarifying the upgrade process," she announced to no one in particular. "There was no priority status recorded under this name. We're just waiting for confirmation." Her words floated like smoke. Vague enough to sound professional, pointed enough to cast suspicion. Rachel took a small step back. She looked like she wanted to vanish. Nadira didn't respond. She didn't argue. She simply asked one question. "Has my boarding pass been changed or canceled?" Rachel shook her head. "No, ma'am. You're still listed as 1A." Nadira's voice remained calm. "Then may I sit down?" There was no venom in her tone, no escalation, just clarity. Sloane stepped forward quickly. "Not yet. We need final word from management." "You've had 10 minutes. Nadira said gently. "And I've been standing." That sentence landed like thunder. No yelling, no confrontation, but the truth of it reverberated through the entire cabin. Someone coughed in the back. Another passenger adjusted their tray table, even though it wasn't out. Janine in 2C pressed record on her phone again. And then, as if scripted by fate, the intercom crackled. It wasn't the captain. It wasn't the gate agent. It was a calm, male voice from the ground team. Firm, direct. "Ms. Mercer, please remain where you are. Do not proceed further until you receive clearance from regional operations. That is not a request." Silence fell like a curtain. Sloane's face froze. Rachel blinked rapidly. Barbara turned and stared straight ahead, hands folded tightly. Terrence leaned forward just slightly, and Nadira. She didn't move. She just adjusted the sleeve of her blazer and took one small step toward her seat. The plane wasn't moving, but something inside the cabin had shifted entirely. The people who had looked away were now looking inward. The ones who had whispered were now quiet. And in the center of it all, Nadira stood not with defiance, not with triumph, but with a grace that made the air feel heavier. Rachel looked over once more. This time, her eyes were wet, and Nadira looked back, her voice low and steady. "You still have time to choose who you are." Then she turned and took her seat. Finally, not because she was given permission, but because she never needed it in the first place. The seat cushion felt firmer than usual, or maybe it was just the weight of everything that had settled into it. Nadira didn't recline. She didn't unfasten the top button of her blazer. She sat perfectly upright in 1A, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, as if the seat had yet to earn her trust. Her body may have relaxed, but her presence hadn't. The rest of the cabin was still, not out of comfort, out of recognition. Whatever they had just witnessed was no longer a misunderstanding. It had graduated into something harder to name, something more delicate to confront. Everyone felt it, but no one quite knew what to do with it. Rachel returned to the aisle quietly and took position near the galley. She glanced at Nadira but didn't speak. Her lips parted briefly, as if she might, but she stopped herself. Her fingers gripped the tablet again, not to check passenger data, but almost like a shield. Sloane had retreated to the rear of first class. She paced in and out of the galley with a forced sense of purpose, occasionally checking the same clipboard that had long stopped mattering. She no longer looked composed. Her hair had slipped slightly from its once perfect ponytail. Her shoulders had tensed into something rigid and narrow. Rachel stepped into the galley to refill a tray of water bottles. As she reached for a glass, she paused. The stillness in her limbs said something was weighing on her. She looked toward the coffee machine, but didn't press any buttons. Instead, she whispered to herself, "I should have said something." She set the glass down. Her hands trembled slightly. Behind her, the curtain shifted as someone passed by to use the lavatory. Rachel stepped aside, murmured an automatic, "Excuse me," and then returned to her jump seat. She sat without buckling in. In the second row, Janine peeked at her phone. The footage she had recorded earlier was clear, steady. She had added a caption draft but hadn't posted anything yet. She scrolled through her gallery again, double-checking the moment when Nadira had been told to stand. The tone of Sloane's voice still rang out in her mind. "You don't belong here." She couldn't stop hearing it. Janine wasn't sure if it was just her moral instinct or if something deeper had been stirred. She remembered being 16, watching her dad get followed by store security for no reason other than the fact that he looked out of place. She hadn't thought about that day in years, until now. Janine locked her phone and looked across the aisle at Nadira. She wanted to say something, anything, but the woman in 1A had the kind of posture that didn't ask for attention. It demanded respect. Still, Nadira hadn't spoken since she sat. Instead, she slowly reached into the inside pocket of her coat, pulled out her phone, and unlocked it. 1 missed call, 2 text messages. She ignored them. She tapped 1 contact. It rang once. A voice picked up. This time she didn't even say hello. "It's active," she said. Redline confirmed. The voice on the other end responded with something short. She nodded once, then ended the call. Less than 10 seconds. No emotion, no raised voice, but it meant something. You could feel it in the air. The kind of call that doesn't announce power, but exercises it. Back near row 3. Terrence Miller tilted his head. He'd noticed. He hadn't heard what she said, but he saw the way she held the phone, the way she put it away with precision. He'd worked in academia long enough to recognize when someone was no longer playing a role in the room. They were controlling it. He looked down at his notebook, one he always carried on flights. He opened to a blank page and wrote 2 words. "Watch her." In the rear galley. Sloane leaned against the wall, phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was low, but there was urgency in it now. "I've already done everything you told me," she whispered. "She's still in the seat." A pause. "No, I didn't remove her. I'm not stupid." Another pause. "Just get back to me before the doors close. I don't want this coming back on me." She clicked the phone off, exhaled, and smoothed down the front of her blouse. Then she stood taller and stepped back into the aisle, trying to regain the posture she had worn earlier. But it didn't fit the same anymore. It was like slipping into a jacket that had shrunk just enough to feel wrong. Rachel caught her eye as she walked past. There was no confrontation in the glance, but there was no deference either. The shift had begun. Sloane walked the aisle slowly, checking overhead bins. Her movements had lost their flow. She adjusted water bottles that didn't need adjusting, flipped safety cards in seat-back pockets that no one had touched. Then she paused by Nadira's row. She didn't speak, didn't make eye contact. She lingered for a second too long, and then moved on. Nadira's eyes remained fixed forward, but her mind was busy. She thought of her father. He had once said to her, after she won her first legal case, "There will come a time when you'll have to teach people who you are without saying your name." This was that time, and she was ready. In row 2D, a young couple sat quietly. The woman leaned toward her partner and whispered, "That's the calmest person I've ever seen in my life." The man nodded slowly. "It's not just calm," he said. "It's control." They both looked forward, not with pity, but with something new, a kind of reverence. Nadira didn't know them, didn't hear them, but she felt the change in atmosphere. The cabin no longer saw her as a question mark. They saw her as a mirror, one that asked, "What would you have done?" Sloane passed again. This time she didn't look at anyone, especially not Nadira. Rachel stood from her seat and leaned slightly toward Nadira's row. Her voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "Would you like something to drink?" Nadira looked at her. Her eyes didn't soften, but they didn't harden either. "Water would be nice," she said. "Cold, if possible." Rachel nodded. And for the first time since the flight had begun boarding, she smiled, a real one. Then she turned toward the galley. and Nadira finally exhaled. The water arrived in a clear plastic cup with no ice, just cool enough to offer a moment of pause. Rachel handed it over with both hands, as if she were passing something sacred. Nadira took it gently, offered a polite nod, then placed the cup carefully on the tray table in front of her. She still hadn't reclined. She hadn't taken off her coat or loosened her shoulders. Her posture remained upright, but her energy had shifted. There was a quietness around her now that wasn't fragile. It was powerful. Across the aisle, Barbara Whitman stole another glance, but quickly looked away when Nadira's gaze met hers. She adjusted her scarf twice. Her fingers kept brushing invisible lint from her lap. For a woman who was always so sure of herself, she suddenly couldn't sit still. Terrence Miller continued to watch. He wasn't judging. He was studying. Every few minutes, he wrote something in his notebook, not in a rush, just a few lines at a time. Observations, impressions, truths in the galley. Sloane placed the phone back in its cradle harder than she meant to. The click was sharper than expected. She turned and faced the curtain, the one separating her from a cabin full of eyes she could no longer control. She had made a call to her supervisor, hoping for affirmation, maybe even cover. What she got instead was a short reply and a warning to stay put until further notice. She wasn't used to that. Usually, her judgment was final, her smile disarming, her uniform a kind of armor. But now, the uniform felt thin. She stepped out into the aisle again. Her clipboard was gone. Her hands clasped in front of her like a student unsure of the rules. She made it to row 2 before Rachel intercepted her with a quiet voice. "They told us to hold," Rachel said. Sloane's nostrils flared. "I know. They're monitoring." "I know," Sloane repeated. "Sharper this time." Passengers turned at the tone. Sloane adjusted her blouse, nodded once, and kept walking. She didn't look toward Nadira. She bypassed the row entirely and headed toward the rear of the plane again. The cabin grew still once more, until the curtain opened, and a new voice entered the space. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain William Reese. We're experiencing a slight delay in departure. We appreciate your patience." The voice was even, well-rehearsed, but the pacing was off, like someone reading a script they didn't believe in. The intercom clicked off. A beat of silence followed, then another. Then Nadira spoke, quietly, to herself. "Now they know." Rachel heard it. So did Terrence, and it wasn't said with spite. It was said with certainty. In 2C, Janine checked her video again. She had uploaded the shorter clip during pre-board. It was already starting to pick up shares. A few comments. One tag from someone she didn't know. She hadn't added Nadira's name yet. She wasn't sure if she should. But something in her told her that this moment, this very scene, mattered more than most things she'd seen on a plane. And she'd flown a lot. She pressed save and waited. Nadira took a small sip of her water. She thought about her mother, about the way she'd once described what it meant to be black and graceful at the same time. It's like balancing a bowl of water on your head while walking through a crowd of people who want to see it spill. She smiled faintly at the memory and sat straighter. Across the aisle, Barbara adjusted her seatbelt again. Her water cup sat full, untouched. The man in 1D, a younger white executive, shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, then looked straight ahead, like he was preparing for turbulence. But there was no turbulence. Not in the air. The storm was already here. It had begun when Sloane questioned Nadira's seat. It had intensified with every delay, every check, every time someone chose to look away instead of speak up. This was the kind of storm that didn't rattle the aircraft. It rattled the assumptions that kept it afloat. Rachel stood near the jump seat, tablet pressed lightly against her chest. She glanced toward Nadira's row again, then toward the curtain. She took a breath and walked back into the galley. Sloane was sitting on the jump seat, elbows on her knees, fingers pressed against her temple. "They're sending someone," she muttered. Rachel didn't reply. Sloane looked up. "You think I meant it like that?" Rachel blinked. "I think that doesn't matter anymore." Sloane stared at her. Rachel continued, "You said she didn't belong. You questioned her ticket. Then you kept doubling down after it was confirmed. I was just following." "No, you weren't," Rachel interrupted. Not loudly, not angrily, just finally. "You saw a black woman in first class and assumed something was off." Sloane leaned back. The jump seat creaked. Rachel stepped out without waiting for a reply. In the cabin, Nadira took another sip of water. The sound of the engines hummed low beneath the floor, a reminder that the plane hadn't moved, but everything else had. Terrence Miller wrote one more line in his notebook. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. He closed the cover gently and sat back. Nadira turned slightly toward the window. The sunlight outside reflected off the tarmac, warm and white. She could see her own reflection faintly in the glass. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened, not out of victory, out of resolve. The storm wasn't about her. It never had been. It was about a system that cracked whenever someone like her showed up without apology. She wasn't trying to disrupt. She was trying to arrive. And for some reason, that alone had become a revolution. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, as if the plane itself was preparing for a shift it couldn't name. The air wasn't heavy with turbulence or cabin pressure, but with something else, anticipation, maybe, or the subtle kind of tension that makes every movement feel louder than it should. Nadira remained in her seat, shoulders squared, gaze steady. She hadn't spoken to anyone since her quiet call earlier. She didn't need to. Her stillness was saying enough. Sloane had returned to the galley but now stood just inside the curtain, arms crossed, her foot tapping against the rubber flooring. Her clipboard had vanished. Her posture no longer commanded presence. It requested it, quietly, desperately. Rachel stood at the beverage station, pretending to organize cups, but her mind was elsewhere. She could hear Sloane muttering under her breath. Short phrases meant for no one and everyone. "This is ridiculous. I didn't do anything wrong." A soft ding broke the murmurs. The intercom cracked to life. But it wasn't the captain's voice this time. It was lower, calmer, and unmistakably authoritative. "Ms. Mercer, please hold your current position. Do not proceed with any further action until instructed by regional operations." The entire cabin stilled. The voice wasn't loud, but its message hit like a wave. Sloane froze. Rachel's head snapped toward the sound. Barbara dropped her pen. The man in 1C, who had barely looked up until now, set his phone down gently and sat straighter. Passengers turned slowly in their seats, trying not to look like they were looking, but very much looking. The sentence had been so neutral, so procedural, and yet it had echoed with consequence. Sloane's face paled. Her mouth opened, but no words came. She stepped backward into the galley and rested one hand against the wall. For the first time since the boarding incident began, she looked uncertain. Rachel finally turned. "What does that mean?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Sloane didn't answer. Instead, she whispered to herself, "They never do this unless it's serious." Back in 1A, Nadira remained composed. She had not flinched at the announcement. She had expected it. She took another sip of water, then placed the cup down quietly. Across the aisle. Jeanne slowly lifted her phone again. She wasn't live streaming. Not yet. But she was recording. Her finger hovered lightly over the button as she framed the shot on Nadira. Elegant, unmoved, undeniable. Terence Miller shifted in his seat, uncrossed his legs, and leaned forward slightly. He didn't need to write anything this time. He just watched. Rachel stepped out from the galley and paused beside Nadira's seat. Her voice was low, almost inaudible over the hum of the air system. "Dr. Ellis," she said, the title deliberate and respectful. Nadira turned slightly. "I'm sorry," Rachel said. Her throat caught. "I should have said something earlier. I should have done more." Nadira didn't smile. She nodded once. "You still can," she said gently. Rachel nodded, swallowed, and took a half step back. She was learning, not just about Nadira, but about herself. Sloane remained hidden behind the curtain, clinging to her silence. Every second felt longer than the last. Her hands trembled slightly. The authority she had worn so confidently earlier had unraveled into something brittle. The intercom crackled again. But this time, no words followed. Just static. And then, footsteps, measured, intentional, from the front of the aircraft. A woman stepped into the cabin. She wasn't in uniform. No epaulets, no name tag. Just a navy blazer, pearl earrings, and a quiet authority that wrapped around her like gravity. Passengers sat taller. Even those who hadn't paid attention before now leaned forward instinctively. Barbara pressed her lips together. Janine stopped recording for a beat, watching with narrowed eyes. The woman paused at row 1. "Dr. Ellis," she said calmly. Nadira looked up. "Yes. My name is Marin Tate. I'm the Director of In-Flight Compliance for United's Eastern Region." A pause. "Thank you for your patience." Nadira nodded once. "Of course." Marin turned toward Rachel. "Could you please ask Ms. Mercer to join us at the front?" Rachel didn't hesitate. She moved swiftly toward the galley and returned moments later with Sloane in tow. The difference in their energy was stark. Rachel upright, focused. Sloane drawn inward, pale, eyes darting. Marin faced her directly. "There has been a review of the incident. Audio logs were accessed. Live gate feed reviewed. The passenger in 1A was confirmed as properly ticketed before boarding." Sloane's mouth opened. Marin raised a hand gently, not to silence, but to redirect. "There is no dispute." She turned slightly, her voice clear enough for the entire cabin to hear. "What is in dispute is how it was handled." The words floated through the air, clear, unshakable. Nadira remained still, but Rachel stepped back instinctively, as if needing to let the moment breathe. Sloane exhaled, short and sharp. "I didn't." Marin didn't let her finish. "You made a judgment, and then you acted on it. Repeatedly. After confirmation." Sloane's shoulders sagged. Her clipboard now felt like dead weight in her hand. Marin reached into her blazer and handed her a folded sheet of paper. "You are being removed from service on this flight. You'll disembark with the terminal supervisor. Further action will be discussed after formal review." Sloane didn't move. She blinked once, twice, then, slowly, she turned and walked down the aisle. This time, she didn't own it. She was escorted by silence, a silence that had changed texture. Now it wasn't awkward. It was deliberate, measured, just like the steps Nadira had taken to get to her seat. Marin watched her leave, then turned to Nadira again. We'll continue when you're ready. Nadira's reply was simple. You just did. Marin nodded and stepped aside. Rachel returned to the jump seat, sat down quietly, and looked forward. She didn't speak. She didn't fidget. She simply exhaled. The cabin exhaled with her. And in seat 1A, Nadira Ellis picked up her water once more. She took a sip, then, finally, reclined her seat by half an inch. Just enough, because she wasn't settling in. She was settling something bigger. The cabin door hadn't closed yet. A hush lingered like morning fog, stretching between passengers who suddenly seemed more alert than they had moments before. Some still pretended to flip through magazines, but their eyes had stopped reading. Others glanced sideways over the rims of their glasses or coffee cups, each trying to process what they'd just seen. Sloane Mercer was gone, escorted down the jet bridge without resistance, without words. Her absence filled the cabin more than her presence ever had. Rachel remained in the forward galley, still near the jump seat, her hands resting in her lap. She didn't fidget now. She just sat there, looking toward the front, toward Nadira. The woman in 1A was reclined a little now, but not in rest. She hadn't sunk into the comfort of the seat. She had simply stopped bracing. Her water was still on the tray, her coat folded across her lap, her eyes calm, but far away. At the rear of first class, Terrence Miller scribbled another line in his notebook. He had stopped trying to describe what was happening. Now he was simply documenting, witnessing, preserving. Janine Rowe, still in 2C, refreshed her phone again. The clip she'd posted had started moving. Comments were stacking. A verified journalist had even reposted it with a single line beneath, "This woman didn't demand justice. She became it." Rachel stood and moved to the curtain. She peered out toward the jet bridge, where a new presence had arrived. Not a flight attendant, not an agent, but someone wearing a tailored charcoal gray suit and moving with the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need introduction. He was tall, early 50s maybe, with silver hair and a smooth posture that said he'd been in plenty of rooms where people talked too much. He stepped into the cabin. The air shifted. He walked forward, calm, collected, and stopped just shy of Nadira's row. "Dr. Ellis," he said, his voice steady and low. "Thank you for your patience." Nadira looked up. "You're welcome," she said simply. He offered a respectful nod. "My name is Malcolm Rhodes. I'm with Corporate Affairs, Executive Division." There was no apology in his voice, but there was something else. Accountability. "I came personally," he continued, "because this flight has activated a red line protocol. That's extremely rare, but this situation deserved it." Nadira said nothing. She didn't have to. Rachel stepped back, giving them space. Malcolm continued, "The footage, the intercom logs, the passenger reports, none of it looks good. But I think you already knew that before I ever boarded." Nadira tilted her head slightly. "I didn't come here to make a point," she said. "I believe that," he replied. "But you did." A brief silence followed. Then he turned to Rachel. "I'll need a short report from you before departure," he said. Rachel nodded once. Her voice didn't tremble this time. "Of course, sir." Barbara Whitman sat frozen, her body stiff. She had said nothing since Sloane was removed. Her hands rested in her lap, but her fingers had gone pale from how tightly they were laced. She wasn't used to being the one observed. Malcolm glanced around the cabin once. "This isn't just about a bad judgment call," he said. "Not to anyone in particular, but loud enough for everyone to hear." It's about what happens when that call goes unchecked. It's about culture, and we're going to address it. He turned back to Nadira. I know you're headed to Seattle for the Equity Council Summit. That surprised a few passengers, especially Barbara. Janine looked up sharply, eyebrows raised. Malcolm continued. You were scheduled to be our keynote speaker on Saturday, and I can tell you now, that speech just gained an entirely new audience. Nadira's face didn't change, but there was a pause in her breath. Malcolm took a single step closer. I won't offer a hollow apology. Not here, not in public, but I will say this, we failed. Not because of a system glitch, but because someone made a decision based on everything except truth. He looked her in the eye, and that won't go unanswered. Nadira nodded once. She didn't gloat. She didn't soften. She simply said, make sure the response isn't just a reaction. Malcolm didn't flinch. That's the plan. He looked to Rachel. You'll get a new lead attendant shortly. Please let the rest of the crew know the remaining service protocol remains unchanged, but internal documentation will be submitted after landing. Yes, sir, Rachel replied. He turned toward the exit, then stopped, looked once more at Nadira. There are a lot of ways people lead, he said. Some shout, some walk out. You just sat down. Then he left. The cabin was so quiet, even the soft hum of the air vents felt intrusive. Nadira closed her eyes for a moment, not in exhaustion, but in relief, not because someone else had finally done something, but because it was done, not resolved, but named, and that mattered. Rachel came over once more, this time with a new blanket. No pressure, she said, almost shyly. But would you like this just in case you get cold? Nadira gave her a soft nod. Thank you. Rachel placed it gently across her lap. Barbara shifted suddenly in her seat. She looked over, then spoke. Her voice was tight, unsure. I didn't know who you were. Nadira looked at her calmly. You didn't need to. Barbara swallowed. I just meant, I assumed, well, she didn't finish. Nadira held her gaze. That was the problem. Barbara blinked, face flushed, then turned back to her window. Terrence Miller gave the smallest nod, barely visible. His pen touched his notebook again. From the cockpit, a voice broke in once more. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reese. We've been cleared for final departure. Please return to your seats and ensure your devices are in airplane mode. The moment wasn't over, but it was moving forward. Rachel secured the galley. Janine saved her draft. Terrence closed his notebook. And Nadira. She placed the folded blanket beside her and watched the runway ahead. The aircraft finally pulled away from the gate. The wheels hummed gently beneath the cabin, and the plane lurched forward, slow but certain, as if even the engines were aware of the shift that had just occurred. There was no chatter, no routine clink of ice against plastic cups, no casual laughter from row 2 or murmured business calls in the back. First class had gone still. Rachel moved methodically through her duties. She rechecked the seatbelts, straightened napkins, but didn't rush. She paused at Nadira's row one more time, not to speak, but just to offer a nod. Nadira returned it with the faintest upward glance. It was enough. In 2C, Janine reviewed the latest stats on her video. It had crossed 25,000 views. A local journalist had commented, proof that strength doesn't need volume. She hadn't expected it to travel this fast. She hadn't even known what exactly she'd been capturing at first, but now it felt like something bigger. She opened her notes and began drafting a new caption, one that didn't just describe the moment but honored it. Across the aisle, Barbara still hadn't touched her drink. She sat with her legs crossed, but her arms weren't folded anymore. Her fingers rested on the rim of the cup. She had always considered herself open-minded, progressive, fair. But that wasn't how fairness worked, was it? Fairness wasn't a label you gave yourself. It was a practice, a pattern of choosing decency, especially when no one asked you to, and she hadn't. Not when it mattered. Barbara's eyes flicked toward Nadira, who now had her coat neatly folded across her lap and a leather-bound notebook in hand. She wasn't writing, just holding it. A man from row 4 stood, walked slowly forward, and paused just beside her seat. He was tall, mid-30s, South Asian, wearing a crisp gray blazer. His expression was sincere. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said softly. Nadira looked up. "For what? For how you handled all of that. With calm. With dignity." She offered a quiet smile. "I didn't do it for applause." "I know," he said. "That's what makes it stick." He gave a respectful nod and returned to his seat. Rachel had overheard the exchange and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Something inside her loosened. The grip of guilt. The fear of saying the wrong thing. It wasn't gone, but it no longer sat heavy on her chest. In the rear of first class, Terence Miller turned a page in his notebook and began to write more deliberately now. His earlier notes had been fragments, impressions, but now his lines took shape. He began forming what looked like a letter. He didn't know who it was for yet. Maybe United, maybe his granddaughter, maybe himself. But he knew the lesson had to be carried forward. In the galley. The new lead flight attendant had arrived. Her name was Melissa, late 40s, calm demeanor, a short salt and pepper bob. She had been briefed quickly before boarding, but the mood in the cabin said more than any supervisor could. She approached Rachel first. "How are things up here?" Rachel hesitated, then replied with a soft but solid voice. "Settling." Melissa nodded. "Good. Let's make sure it stays that way." She turned toward Nadira's row and stopped a few feet short. "Dr. Ellis," she said gently, "would you prefer your meal now? Or after takeoff?" Nadira looked up. "After is fine. Thank you." Melissa smiled and moved on. Rachel watched the exchange, then turned back to the jump seat. She sat for a few seconds before pulling out her own notepad from a small pouch in the galley. It was mostly filled with safety checks and routine reminders, but now she flipped to a blank page. She wrote, "I watched a woman stay seated while the world tried to tell her she didn't belong there, and then the world had to catch up." She read it once, then underlined it. Across the cabin, passengers began to return to themselves, slowly, cautiously. The hum of air recirculation filled the gaps where conversation hadn't yet returned. One or two people opened laptops, but their eyes kept drifting toward row 1. They weren't just watching anymore. They were remembering. Moments ago, the question had been whether Nadira belonged. Now the question was whether anyone else had the courage to act like she did. Barbara finally spoke, not loudly, just enough for the space between their seats. "I hope they do something with that video." Nadira glanced over. "I don't think the video matters as much as what people feel afterward." Barbara swallowed. "I'm one of those people." Nadira's tone was gentle but firm. "Then decide what you'll do with that." Barbara didn't reply. She looked down, but this time, not out of avoidance, out of contemplation. Janine hit publish. She didn't add music or filters, just the clip, with a caption, "Flight attendant tells black woman she doesn't belong." 11 minutes later, the world finds out who she really is. Her name is Dr. Nadira Ellis. As the video uploaded, she whispered under her breath, "Let them see," because silence, she knew now, was never neutral. Terrence finished his letter and folded it. He would mail it to the airline, with no expectation of response, just the knowledge that it needed to exist. Rachel returned to Nadira's row with a warm cloth and another glass of water. "This one has ice," she said, smiling slightly. Nadira accepted it. "Thank you," she said, and this time, she meant it not just for the water, but for the shift. The smallest acts ripple outward. A cup of water, a recording, a line written in a notebook, a quiet nod, and sometimes a seat taken not as a privilege, but as a declaration. One that says, without needing to be shouted, "I belong here, and I won't move." 38 minutes into the flight, the plane had reached cruising altitude. The seatbelt signs dimmed with a soft chime. Passengers stirred, stretching limbs and reaching for devices tucked into seat backs. But the tension never fully left the cabin. It hung in the air, not heavy, but present, like a perfume that lingered long after someone had left the room. Nadira still hadn't opened her notebook. It sat resting on the tray table, the leather cover untouched. She had flipped through hundreds of these over the years: courtroom notes, client statements, community strategy plans, but this one held something different. She had brought it on this flight to prepare her keynote, a speech she had thought she'd write in peace. But now, everything that had just unfolded had written it for her. Rachel passed by with a fresh pot of coffee. She didn't ask Nadira if she wanted any. She simply nodded and moved past, respecting the space. The gesture was small, but filled with meaning. Further back in 2C, Janine's post had crossed 100,000 views. She didn't expect that. She also didn't expect the direct message from a national morning show producer. "Hi, Janine. This is Madison from Sunrise Today. Can you confirm the identity of the woman in one?" Janine hesitated. She glanced toward Nadira, who sat in calm composure, unaware of the ripple now racing ahead of her. Janine didn't respond immediately. She leaned back in her seat, placed her phone face down, and crossed her arms. Not yet, she thought. Let her have this moment, undisturbed. Terrence had folded his letter, addressed and sealed it. He had signed his name with care, not because he expected applause, but because stories like this didn't belong in silence. They belonged in history. Melissa, the new lead flight attendant, returned to Nadira's row with a meal tray. Her tone was kind, gentle. "Roasted salmon or lemon pasta?" "Doctor." Ellis Nadira looked up. "Pasta, please." As Melissa placed the tray down, she added softly, "If there's anything you need, anything at all, please let me know." Nadira nodded, offering a quiet thank you. She was tired, not from the confrontation, but from the weight of being watched, studied, judged. This wasn't the first time she'd been asked to prove her right to exist in a space. It probably wouldn't be the last. But today, something had shifted. She hadn't had to raise her voice. Others had done it for her. That mattered. Barbara finally spoke again. "I keep thinking about that moment," she said aloud. Nadira didn't look at her. Barbara continued anyway. "When Sloan told you to move, and you didn't argue, I thought you were just trying not to escalate things." Nadira turned her head, meeting her gaze. "I wasn't avoiding escalation. I was giving them a chance to correct themselves." Barbara blinked. "They didn't." "No," Nadira said. "They didn't." Barbara opened her mouth, then closed it again. She wasn't sure what she wanted to say. She only knew that silence felt dishonest now. "I'm sorry," she finally said. Nadira nodded once. No smile. No anger. "Thank you." The words hung in the air between them, not as closure, but as recognition, the kind that makes you sit differently in your seat. Melissa moved quietly through the cabin. Her presence was calm, but she was listening closely, and every eye glance, every tense breath. She'd seen moments like this before, but rarely had they ended with such clarity. In row 4, a young girl leaned toward her mother and whispered, "Is that the lady everyone's talking about?" The mother gave her daughter a soft look. "She's a lawyer," she whispered back. "But why was she in trouble?" The girl asked. "She wasn't." The mother replied, "Someone else was." The girl nodded slowly, then looked forward. Nadira took a bite of her pasta. It was average lukewarm, a little too creamy, but for the first time since takeoff. She allowed herself to eat. She thought about her father, how he used to tell her that sometimes the biggest victories happen quietly, not in courtrooms, but in moments when people choose to stop pretending. Rachel stood in the galley, wiping down a counter that didn't need cleaning. She was replaying her own silence, over and over. She had hesitated when it mattered, but she had also spoken later. Would that be enough? She didn't know, but she would make sure it counted now. Janine finally picked up her phone again. She typed back to the producer. "Yes, her name is Dr. Nadira Ellis. She's a civil rights attorney, but I won't share more until she says it's okay. This isn't just a story, it's her life." She hit send and locked her screen. Let the rest of the world wait. Inside her head, Nadira was already outlining her speech for Seattle. She knew the exact sentence she would begin with. "I boarded that plane, thinking I was there to speak at a summit. Turns out, I was already in one. It wasn't clever. It was honest." She would talk about the seat, not because it was about comfort, but because it had become a symbol, a test, a mirror, and in the reflection, an entire system had seen itself and blinked. Her phone buzzed gently in her lap. One new message. It was from Malcolm Rhodes. Just 2 words. "We're listening." Nadira didn't reply. Not yet. But she looked out the window at the sky beyond the clouds, and for the first time in hours, she breathed freely. Because sometimes, recognition isn't about being seen. It's about no longer being questioned. The cabin had settled into a rhythm. Drinks were refilled, blankets unfolded, trays collected. But beneath the surface of routine, the atmosphere had shifted. There was a quiet respect now. Not the kind forced by titles or uniforms, but the kind earned when truth cuts through expectation. Nadira leaned slightly against the window. Her meal tray had been cleared. The notebook now rested open across her lap. A pen glided slowly across the page, forming ideas that had simmered for weeks but now carried a sharpened edge. The keynote speech she'd planned was gone. This would be something else entirely. She began her new draft. "Today I sat down in seat 1A. Not to provoke, not to protest, just to sit. But sometimes, sitting down becomes the boldest act in the room, not because of volume, but because of presence." She paused, tapping the pen gently on the leather binding. Across the aisle, Barbara remained still. She hadn't spoken again, but her posture had changed. Shoulders relaxed, eyes less guarded. She no longer needed to explain herself. That ship had sailed. Now, she was simply listening. 2 rows back, the young girl from earlier peeked forward again. "Mom," she whispered. Why did people think she didn't belong? The mother hesitated. Sometimes, she said carefully, people confuse power with permission. They think only certain people are allowed to take up space. The girl frowned. But that's not fair. It's not. The girl nodded firmly, as if filing it away for later. Terence Miller had finished his letter, stamped and ready for mailing after landing. He now sat with his chin resting in his hand, watching Nadira without intruding. He hadn't seen someone hold a room like this in years, and she hadn't even said a word to most of them. It reminded him of a quote from his college lectures. True power is when your silence demands more answers than their questions ever will. He wondered if she knew that was exactly what she had done. Melissa checked in once more. This time, not as a formality. She leaned toward Nadira, lowered her voice. There's a young woman in coach. She asked if she could speak to you when you have a moment. Nadira raised an eyebrow. Melissa continued, She's a law student. Saw what happened. Said she recognized you from an article. Nadira smiled softly. Tell her I'll come back. Melissa nodded and returned to the galley. Nadira closed her notebook gently and tucked it into her bag. She stood, stretched slightly, and stepped into the aisle. The entire cabin seemed to shift when she moved not out of obligation, but curiosity, respect. She walked down the narrow aisle, heels quiet against the carpet. Coach was silent as she entered. The law student was seated on the left, aisle seat, early 20s, afro pulled into a high puff, nervous smile waiting. Nadira stopped beside her. Hi, the young woman said. I'm Ava. Nadira, she said, offering her hand. Ava looked starstruck. I watched the whole thing. I didn't know what to do. I kept thinking, what if that was me one day? Nadira sat in the empty seat beside her, calm and steady. It very well could be, she said gently. The question is, what will you do when it is Ava's throat tightened? I want to do what you did, but I'm not sure I could stay that calm. Nadira smiled. It's not about calm. It's about clarity. You don't need to be silent. You just need to be sure. Ava nodded quickly, blinking back emotion. You gave a master class today, she whispered. Nadira shook her head. No, she said softly. Life did. I just paid attention. They sat there in silence for a moment, surrounded by the hum of the cabin, the kind of silence that teaches more than any lecture. Nadira eventually stood. Keep going. Ava, you'll find your seat. Just make sure no one tells you it's not yours. Ava smiled wide, eyes shining. I won't forget this. Nadira returned to the front, walking past rows of passengers who now saw her with different eyes. Some smiled, some nodded. No one looked away. In first class, Janine had finally responded to the national producer. She's aware of the post now. She's not seeking attention. Please respect that. Madison from Sunrise today replied almost immediately. Understood, but tell her we'd be honored to amplify her message if she ever chooses. Janine smiled to herself. Respect wasn't always given, but it could be offered. She looked forward to row 1A and whispered, Thank you. Rachel stood in the galley again, organizing a drawer that didn't need sorting. She turned to Melissa and asked, Do you think she'll speak about this publicly? Melissa shrugged, a half smile on her lips. She already has, just not the way most people expect. Rachel leaned back, watching Nadira settle into her seat once more. The woman didn't need a podium. The entire cabin had become her stage. And without ever standing up to shout, She had already delivered the most important keynote of her life. The captain's voice returned to the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our initial descent into Seattle shortly. Please return to your seats and ensure your tray tables are secured." It was the kind of announcement most passengers had heard 100 times before, but today it landed differently. The descent wasn't just about altitude. It was about coming back to Earth after a moment that had lifted something in all of them. Nadira fastened her seatbelt and looked out the window. The soft glow of the evening sky brushed against the horizon, casting everything in gold. Clouds drifted like slow thoughts. Her reflection hovered faintly in the window's curve. She thought about her father again, about how he used to say, "You don't change the system by shouting at it. You change it by sitting still long enough that it starts hearing itself." She smiled softly. Today had proven that right. Rachel returned one last time to check on first class. Her posture was no longer stiff, her voice no longer uncertain. She paused beside Nadira, resting one hand lightly on the seat back. "I don't know if I said it clearly before," she began, "but I learned something from you today." Nadira looked up. Rachel continued, "I always thought speaking up meant being loud. But watching you, it reminded me that quiet doesn't mean passive." Nadira's voice was calm and warm. Sometimes quiet is the loudest thing in the room. Rachel nodded. "I won't forget that." Behind her, Barbara sat with her arms crossed but not defensively. Her gaze was steady now, thoughtful. She had spent the last hour turning over more than just words. She had spent it questioning the framework that allowed her to believe she could assume someone didn't belong. She wasn't sure who she'd be when she got off this plane, but she knew who she didn't want to be anymore. Farther back. Ava adjusted her headphones and scrolled through a few notes on her tablet. Her legal ethics professor had always spoken about theory, but today she'd seen practice. She would carry this moment into every courtroom she ever entered. Terrence leaned back and closed his eyes briefly. The gentle hum of dissent settled into his bones like music. He had mailed the letter in his mind a dozen times already. Tomorrow, he would walk it to the post office himself. It wasn't about complaint. It was about conscience. Janine checked her phone again. Her post had crossed 400,000 views. Offers had come in. Interviews, segments, follow-ups. But she hadn't responded to any of them. She wasn't chasing a headline. She was guarding a moment. Sometimes, protecting someone's dignity mattered more than platforming their pain. The cabin lights flickered slightly as the plane dipped lower. Seattle's lights sparkled beneath the clouds like a quiet city waiting for something. Melissa walked through first class, her clipboard tucked under her arm. She gave Nadira a small nod as she passed. Not as a crew member, but as a woman who had watched another woman hold an entire institution accountable without ever standing. Nadira exhaled slowly. She wasn't angry. She wasn't proud. She was just present. That was enough. The wheels touched down with a soft bump. A ripple ran through the cabin. Not applause, not tension, just breath. Everyone had been holding it without knowing. Now they could let it go. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Rachel prepared the exit area. Melissa read the final arrival script with crisp calm. Janine turned to Terrence and whispered, "You think they'll talk about this in the news?" He didn't look up. They already are. Just not with microphones. At the front of the aircraft, a United Gate manager stood waiting. Next to her was Malcolm Rhodes, once again in his tailored suit, eyes scanning the passenger list. When the doors opened, Melissa motioned for Nadira to wait. Rachel gave her a soft smile. "Please, let us help you with your things." Nadira shook her head gently. "I've got it." She reached for her bag, tucked her notebook inside, and stood. The movement was smooth, confident, undeniable. As she stepped into the jet bridge, Malcolm extended a hand. "Dr. Ellis," he said, "welcome to Seattle. Your ride is waiting. I've also cleared time tomorrow morning if you'd like to speak with the board privately." Nadira shook his hand. "I'll let you know." Behind her, the gate manager handed her a new boarding pass for the return trip. First class. No expiration, no seat number assigned. Just her name, and 2 words printed in bold, guaranteed placement. Nadira tucked it into her bag, not for the seat, but for what it symbolized. As she stepped away, Ava rushed to catch up. "Dr. Ellis," Nadira turned. "Can I walk with you?" "Just for a moment." Nadira smiled. "Of course." They moved slowly through the terminal together. 2 women at different points in the same journey. "What happens now?" Ava asked quietly. Nadira thought for a moment. Now she said, "Now the people who thought they could decide where others belong will have to sit with what they did. And more importantly, with what they didn't do." Ava nodded. Nadira looked over at her. "And you'll tell the next part of the story." When they reached the curb, a black sedan waited. The driver opened the door and gave a respectful nod. Nadira turned once more to Ava. "Remember," she said gently, "some battles don't need volume, just presence." Ava smiled, eyes wide with something close to reverence. Then Nadira stepped into the car. As the door closed behind her, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The flight was over, but the journey was just beginning. She never raised her voice. She never stood up to argue. She just sat down and didn't move. And that one simple act shattered an entire illusion. That dignity is something to be approved, instead of something we carry with us. Dr. Nadira Ellis reminded the world that real power doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it just doesn't flinch. But this story isn't only about her. It's about every person who's ever been told they're in the wrong place. Every quiet moment that should have been a seat at the table, but turned into a fight just to be seen. Let this story be a mirror. Let it also be a map. Because what we do next, how we speak, how we stand, how we see each other, that's where change begins. And if this story moved you, if it made you pause, made you feel, made you question, then don't let it stop here. Hit like, share it with someone who needs to feel seen, and subscribe for more stories like this. Stories that challenge, that heal, and that refuse to look away. We'll see you in the next video. And remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay seated.